I recognize the Honourable Member for Coquitlam, Malawi.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I am pleased to rise to my feet today to speak to the 2017 budget, also known more colloquially as the Forget Everything budget. So, Honourable Speaker, the budget, it is sprinkled with a handful of election goodies just weeks before the election, but my constituents in Coquitlam-Millardville actually see right through it. They know that this is a pre-election budget crafted specifically for the few weeks before the election and designed to get people to forget what life has been like for them under this BC Liberal government. The number one issue, Honourable Speaker, that I have been hearing consistently on the doorstep over these last 4 years that I have been a member of this legislature is that affordability has been a very significant issue. I've been on the doorstep every few weeks for the last 4 years, and time and time again on the doorstep, people talked about their concerns about affordability in this province. Now, this budget is designed to encourage British Columbians to actually forget how this government has made life more unaffordable for you and your families. And since I was elected, Honourable Speaker, and I've been on the doorstep I'd mentioned earlier, and I've heard from constituents who just would talk about just how expensive life was for them. They were working harder and harder, and they could not get ahead at all. They found that wages were flat, government fees were going up, and people, Honourable Speaker, they were really worried for their future. On the doorstep this fall, I heard from different groups of people in different groups, and they each had slightly different concerns related to affordability. And I think in order to really capture what their experience has been under this government, I think it's important to sort of describe what those groups talked about and what they complained about, because they're not represented in this budget at all. So I heard from families, Honourable Speaker, families who were talking about how much harder it was to pay for all the things that they were expected to pay for. Increase in school fees, increases in MSP, increases in ICBC, increases in hydro. They were finding that while they were working, they had jobs, they were picking up extra shifts. Extra shifts, Honourable Speaker. You know what that means for them? It means for them that they are spending less time with their families, less time with their children. They found that childcare costs were just outrageous. They were finding that now they had to pay a toll to go across the bridge into Surrey, that was adding to their costs. The other group that I heard from, Honourable Speaker, were single young adults. So I'd be knocking in Millardville, and we have quite a collection of basement suites in that community. And there were lots of people, often single people, sometimes young, sometimes older, but often single people or living with friends. And I asked them about what life has been like for them under this government, and they talked about housing affordability. Typically, they would have low-paying jobs. So they all had jobs, but they had low-paying jobs, perhaps minimum wage. And they were having a real hard time either finding a place to live, so they had to take in a roommate, so there might be a one-bedroom basement suite, but there were 2 or 3 people living in it, in order to make ends meet. They were finding that rents were so expensive that on these very flat wages, they could not make ends meet. And the possibility of home ownership, the possibility of ever having enough money to put down a down payment was impossible. There was just no way they were going to be able to do that. They didn't know how they were going to get ahead, Honourable Speaker. They didn't know how they were going to move forward with their lives. Now, the third group that I heard from that had concerns about affordability, Honourable Speaker, those are seniors. And these are people who have spent their entire lives working hard, raising their children. They've been living often in the same home for 30 or 40 years. And they were just finding that their ability to keep up with the expenses was next to impossible. Increased hydro rates, increased ICBC rates, paying for all of their medications was becoming a challenge. So much so, Honourable Speaker, that there were some seniors who were choosing to not fulfill all of their prescriptions that the doctor gave them. Or they were making their own medical choices of skipping their medications and only going to every other day to take them because they felt like they just couldn't afford, they just can't keep up. So what frustrates me about this budget is I think of those people. I think of those people that I talk to because those are my constituents. That's who I represent here when I'm in this House. And I listen to the budget and I've read through the budget documents, and all I can say, Honourable Speaker, is that this government wants you to forget a whole bunch of things. They want you to forget that this government, under this Premier, has actually doubled the medical services plan fees. Just last year, Honourable Speaker, the Premier told British Columbians that the reason she valued the MSP was to remind British Columbians that medical services in this province aren't free, suggesting that MSP fees actually went to pay for direct medical costs. And this year, Honourable Speaker, she is telling British Columbians that these fees actually don't go to pay for health care, everybody knows that, and that she never really liked these fees anyway. So which is it? She wants to remind everybody that they're an important part of paying for our medical services, and that she wants to keep them, or maybe this year she doesn't want to keep them. This Premier wants you to forget that just last year, when she was explaining yet another increase to MSP premiums, she told us that it was for our own good. We should remember that this fee serves as a good reminder that health care isn't free. And this year, just weeks before an election, she wants us to forget that patronizing and disrespectful excuse for making British Columbians pay more. This year, the Premier suddenly realizes, and perhaps it was a poll paid for by her well-connected friends and insiders, that British Columbians don't need a reminder that health care isn't free. This year, this Premier is pretending that her increases to this flat tax has never even been a problem for British Columbians. She wants you to forget that she has made life more unaffordable for you. And it's not just increases in the MSP that have contributed to the affordability crisis. She wants you to forget that your hydro bills and your car insurance keep going up. And since the MLA from Kelowna became Premier, she wants you to forget that families are paying more than $1,000 more each and every year in increased MSP premiums, ICBC rates, and hydro rates. So when I think of those families, and I think of those seniors, and when I think of those young adults, they're not making that up, Honourable Speaker. They have been paying more every year. And it's this Premier who wants those people to forget. Hydro rates alone will have gone up by 60% by the end of March 2019, since 2011, when the member from Kelowna became Premier. So under this Premier's watch, those rates have gone up 60%. So while life is getting more and more and more unaffordable under this government, it's only in the weeks before an election that the Premier thinks it's time for this "forget how we made life more difficult for you" budget. And let's see what kind of goodies this Premier has, just hoping that you'll forget. So the only goodie in this budget to ease the affordability issue is the suggestion that this government at some time in the future will perhaps reduce MSP premiums. But be sure still that you pay more for hydro and more for car insurance. But they're saying that their plan to actually reduce the MSP premiums won't start till 2018. Kind of like promises of a GP for me, debt-free BC, and LNG, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So while the Premier wants you to forget how much tougher life is for you and your family under this government, she also wants you to forget that she took a second salary from the BC Liberal Party to top up her Premier's salary. This Premier wants you to forget her private parties and pay-for-access events that not only contributed big bucks towards her re-election, she wants you to forget that she got paid for actually hosting these private events. The Premier wants you to forget how she gave a tax break to the wealthiest 2% of British Columbians back in 2013. She wants you to forget that while you paid more, her friends who were paying for her second salary were getting a tax break. Think about that. Her friends paid money for fundraisers for which the Premier collected a $50,000 annual salary, and she gave them a tax break. She wants you to forget how badly this stinks. So what else does this Premier want you to forget? Well, she certainly wants you to forget about the GP for me promise that was supposed to ensure a GP for every British Columbian by 2015. Well, that didn't materialize. And this government has certainly dropped the promise and commitment to make sure that everyone actually does get a GP. Premier wants you to forget about the LNG promise. Remember that one? That one that we all heard about the last election? LNG was going to be the savior for all of us. We would have a prosperity fund that would take care of us. Our coffers would be overflowing with cash. We would even eliminate that sales tax. Well, that didn't materialize. There was barely a mention of LNG in this budget. What was once the opportunity of a lifetime, a generational opportunity, has been reduced to an insignificant mention in this budget. There is no revenue from LNG, and the money that this government has used to line the Prosperity Fund, well, that's your tax dollars. They've used your tax dollars to put money into an account that was supposed to be flush with money from LNG. The Premier wants you to forget that there is no money from LNG, so she took some of your tax dollars and put it in the Prosperity Fund, hoping you'll forget where the money came from. Remember the BC Liberal campaign bus from 2013? Debt-free BC. Well, the Premier now wants you to forget her record on that one too. Total debt is forecast to go up by $11 billion over the 3-year fiscal plan, from $66.7 billion as of March 31st to $77.7 billion as of March 2020. Total government debt has doubled under this government's increasing by $32.9 billion since 2011. The last fiscal year of the NDP government in the 90s, the debt was $33.8 billion. And under this government, that debt has ballooned by 97% to $66.7 billion. Now, just to be thorough on this debt issue, the Premier from March 2011 to March 2017 has added $21.5 billion to the debt. That's the biggest increase in debt in BC's history. So given this Premier's track record on GP for Me, Debt-Free BC, and LNG, why would anyone believe that there might actually be any relief on MSP in 2018? They didn't deliver on any of those other things. Why would anyone believe this one? Now, this Premier does say all kinds of things when it's election time, but there's a history of not delivering. And she wants you to forget that she just doesn't deliver. So what else is in this budget that this Premier is trying to make you forget? Oh, yes. Her newfound commitment to public education. The one, where the Supreme Court of Canada forced the Premier to properly fund public education in this province? Well, the Premier wants you to forget how public education has suffered under her leadership. First, as Minister of Education, back when she was first in government. She wants you to forget how, as Premier, years later, she then provoked the longest teacher strike in history. And now that the Supreme Court of Canada, in less than 20 minutes, told this Premier that she was actually acting illegally, she wants to turn around and just call it an opportunity. She wants you to forget that she spent millions and millions of tax dollars that could have gone into educating your children, and she spent it instead on lawyers. The Premier wants you to forget that she chose to purposefully underfund education. She chose to tie this issue up for years in the court system, and then only when she ran out of options did she turn around and call this decision to properly fund education an opportunity. She wants you to forget what she did to an entire generation of children. She also wants you to forget the incredibly long wait lists to have children assessed for special needs over that generation. She wants you to forget how our schools had to make choices between music teachers, art teachers, and teacher librarians, not to say anything of speech and language pathologists, psychologists, and others who made life richer for our children. The Premier wants you to forget all the fundraising you had to do to replace outdated and broken computer equipment in our schools. The Premier wants you to forget that schools aren't seismically upgraded yet. The Premier wants you to forget about all the reams of paper that you had to provide on that list of school supplies at the beginning of the school year because there was no budget to properly fund the necessary photocopying. The Premier wants you to forget watching the principal clean up the vomit in the hallway because there was no custodian, there was no funds to hire any custodians during the day to keep the hallways and classrooms clean. The Premier wants you to forget that your children had to share textbooks in the class, meaning that your child had to work more slowly until her classmates could catch up before your child could actually turn the page to complete their work. Now, the Premier doesn't just want you to forget about her choices regarding public education. She wants you to forget what is happening to your parents and the seniors in our province. What surprised me, Honourable Speaker, was that there wasn't any significant mention of seniors in this budget. The Seniors Advocate had produced some very interesting well-researched reports on housing, income supports, transportation, and caregivers, and the role that these important people played in supporting our seniors. And the BC Seniors Advocate produced 2 significant reports looking at staffing for residential care, our real most vulnerable seniors. Last year, the BC Seniors Advocate noted that over 80% of facilities did not meet the government's own recommended guidelines of 3.36 hours of care per day per resident. And we were told that they would do better. Ministry of Health said, we'll do better. I heard that. And would have imagined that they would do better. But we are to forget, I would imagine, this is what the Premier wants, that we would forget that here we are a year later, and the same report a year later notes that actually things have gotten worse. That 91% of care facilities in this province do not meet these recommended guidelines. Now, the cynical part of me is asking, how is this possible? How is this possible that in an election year, this government wouldn't say anything about seniors and residential care? These are scathing reports. Well, the first thing, that things have gotten worse, how is that possible? And how could they not even mention it as a concern? It's like I'm still sort of a little bit puzzled by that. Now, the cynical part of me, Honourable Speaker, wonders if the plan is to make some sort of special announcement as we get closer to the election as part of the strategy to try to make you forget how this government has failed to care for our most vulnerable citizens. Are we going to get some big splashy announcement sort of in the days leading up to the election that sort of says, aha, we're going to take care of your parents. We're going to just throw all this money in. We're going to make sure that they have every single resource that they need. Because in the days before the election, people are paying close attention. That is when people are most attuned. And in this strategy to make people forget, I would imagine that maybe that's part of the plan, Honourable Speaker. The cynical part of me wonders if this absence of any significant mention of seniors is yet another ploy of this Premier to withhold funding until such time when she can maximize an announcement to her benefit, to meet her needs, to help her get elected. Honourable Speaker, there has been so much damage and neglect that this government wants you to forget. The Premier wants you to forget about the spiraling housing prices that put the idea of home ownership out of the realm of possibility for most young people just starting out. The Premier wants you to forget her government's treatment of those with disabilities and the bus pass clawback and the people who are just horrified that any government would do that to these citizens. The Premier wants you to forget the years of neglect for child and youth mental health that actually saw a reduction in youth substance abuse beds over time. The Premier wants you to forget that they are 7 years into a 10-year mental health and addiction plan, a plan that has resulted in families remortgaging their homes so that they can send their children to treatment and support in the U.S. because they just couldn't find it here. It just didn't exist. Or the waits were so long. These families, Honourable Speaker, are not going to forget. The families in my constituency are not going to forget. They are not going to forget how life has become more difficult, more unaffordable for them and their families. They're not going to forget how their children have suffered. An entire generation of children have suffered with chronic underfunding of education by this government. And those living with mental illness, substance abuse disorder, those who've lost children to the opioid crisis, they're not going to forget either. They're going to remember that when their children and their loved ones made phone calls looking for help, when they called to go to detox and were told it's a 3-week wait, when they went to an addiction doctor and were told they're going to have to wait a month before they can see an addiction doctor, when they got through treatment and were looking for a recovery house and were told that there's no beds for a recovery house, when they got through detox and were asked to go to a long-term treatment, but there was a 6-week wait for treatment, they're not going to forget. No one is going to forget. No one in British Columbia is going to forget how this government has neglected people. They've remembered their friends. They gave them a 2%, the top 2% tax break, Honourable Speaker, but they forgot the people of British Columbia. And I will do everything in my power to help them remember what life has been like under this government. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member.